Do it, my king. Lyra did not say the words aloud. She had no right to say anything at all tonight. But she thought them, sharp and final as a blade, pressed against the inside of her ribs, where no one would ever see the wound. Do it. Crown her. Let it be over. The grand hall of Moonspire Keep had been dressed for celebration. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above the marble floor, casting cold, beautiful light over a sea of nobles who had come to witness history. Lords and ladies of every great wolf house filled the chamber shoulder to shoulder, their breath held in collective suspension. At the altar at the center of it all stood the Alpha King, tall, dark-clad, devastatingly still, the kind of man who could make a crowded room feel like it had been built around him alone. To his left stood Seraphine. She wore white silk and silver embroidery, a delicate crown of pearls already resting against her golden hair like it had always belonged there. Her chin was lifted. Her smile was composed and precise, the smile of a woman who had spent her entire life rehearsing this exact moment. To his right stood Lyra, head bowed, hands clasped. The sister no one was watching. The House Valamont Alliance had demanded this. 6 months of starvation, sickness, and encroaching enemies had demanded this. The survival of every wolf in this pack, men, women, children she had trained beside and bled for, had demanded this. Lyra had agreed. She had stood before the council and offered herself like a stone dropped into still water, calmly, without ceremony, and said the words she had rehearsed in the dark until they stopped feeling like they would kill her. If my place as Luna is the price for our people to survive, then I will step aside. The elder priest raised his voice above the silence. By the laws of the moon, the Alpha shall mark his chosen Luna and seal the bloodline of this pack. The ceremonial blade caught the light. Seraphine stepped forward. Lyra let her gaze fall to the polished marble at her feet. It was easier than watching his face, easier than letting herself search for something in his expression that she no longer had any right to look for. She had made her choice. He had accepted it. The world had moved on, and tonight it would make that official in front of every noble house in the realm. She would leave before dawn, quietly, without goodbyes. Just another forgotten name in the history of a pack she had given everything to protect. The elder turned to Seraphine, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Lady Seraphine Valamont, do you accept the crown of Luna and all responsibilities of the Alpha's chosen mate? Seraphine's voice rang out like a bell, clear and triumphant. I do. The crowd exhaled as one. Murmurs of approval, the sound of relief dressed as celebration. Lyra breathed out slowly. It's done. It's finally... Stop. One word. It hit the chamber like a fist striking stone. The elder froze. The ceremonial crown hovered inches from Seraphine's bowed head, suspended in the sudden, bewildered silence. Lyra's gaze snapped upward before she could stop herself. The Alpha King had raised his hand. His dark eyes were not on Seraphine. They were on the council elders. And his expression, the composed ruler who had stood unmoved through 3 brutal winters, through siege negotiations and poison attempts, and 100 impossible decisions, was gone. What remained in his place was something older and far more dangerous. A wolf who had run out of patience. A king who had finally decided the performance was over. Seraphine turned, her composure cracking at the edges. My king? He didn't answer her. Instead, he reached inside his coat. The gasp that moved through the hall was not one sound, but 100 rippling outward from the altar like a stone dropped into still water as he withdrew a small iron dagger. Its blade shimmered with faint red runes, pulsing softly in the chandelier light like something half alive. Ancient magic. The elder priest's face drained of color. That blade, he whispered. Yes, the Alpha King said, his voice perfectly, dangerously calm. A blood oath dagger. The whispers ignited into chaos. Seraphine's mouth opened, then closed. The first real fear Lyra had ever seen on her sister's face moved behind her eyes, like a shadow crossing the moon. What is the meaning of this? Seraphine demanded, her composure sharpening into fury. The Alpha King turned toward her. Then slowly, deliberately, his gaze moved past her. To Lyra. Raise your head. She hadn't realized she had lowered it again. She looked up, and for one suspended moment the entire crowded hall seemed to fall away, the nobles, the elders, the blazing chandeliers, until there was only the distance between them and the unreadable expression on his face that she had spent 6 months learning not to decipher. His voice dropped just enough that only she could hear the edge beneath it. "I need you to stay." Then he faced the court, lifted the dagger so that every eye in the room could see the runes burning red along its blade, and spoke loud enough to shake the rafters. "This ceremony," he announced, "was never meant to strengthen this pack." The room stilled. It was designed to enslave it. But to understand why the Alpha King would risk war, exile, and the wrath of every great noble house in the realm to stop a crown from touching Seraphine Valamont's head, you have to go back 6 months, to the day the pack began to die, and the day Lyra chose to let herself be forgotten so that the people she loved might live. The valley smelled like death before the snow even fell. Lyra remembered that detail more clearly than anything else from those first terrible weeks, the way the cold carried something underneath it. Something wrong, like rot dressed in winter. She had walked the eastern borders alone on a grey October morning, 6 months before the ceremony that would unmake her, and known instinctively that what was coming for the Silver Moon Pack would not announce itself with armies or fire. It would arrive quietly. It already had. The livestock went first. 40 head of cattle found stiff in the southern fields on a single morning, their hides unmarked, their eyes filmed over with a pale, milky white that none of the healers could explain. Within a fortnight, the sheep followed. Then the grain stores in the lower village began to turn not rot exactly, but a slow, creeping blackening that moved through the sacks like ink through water, leaving nothing edible behind. By the time the younger wolves began falling sick, the pack already knew it was starving. The elders called emergency councils. The healers worked without sleep. Warriors who had spent their lives preparing for war against rival packs found themselves helpless against something they couldn't track, couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with. Trade routes that had kept Moonspire supplied for generations closed as neighboring territories, fearing contagion, shut their borders and stopped answering letters. Allies went quiet. Enemies did not. 3 separate incursions along the northern ridge in the span of 2 months, probing attacks, not full assaults, but enough to tell anyone paying attention that the wolves circling their borders had caught the scent of weakness. Lyra had stood on the ramparts with the Alpha King on the night of the second attack and watched the fires on the ridge without speaking. There was nothing to say. They both understood what those fires meant. The pack was bleeding from the inside, and the predators outside were waiting for it to fall. House Valamont arrived on a Tuesday, 3 carriages, black lacquered and gold trimmed, rolling through Moonspire's gates with the unhurried confidence of people who already knew the answer before the question was asked. Lord Aldrich Valamont, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, had not come to offer charity. He had come to offer a transaction. Lyra had stood at the back of the great council chamber and listened to him lay it out with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed it many times. Grain enough to last 2 winters, a company of 200 soldiers, 3 master healers trained in rare illness, and a trade alliance that would reopen every closed border within a month. Everything the pack needed to survive. One condition: the Alpha King would take Seraphine Valamont as his Luna. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room all the way to the ceiling and pressed down. Lyra did not move. She did not look at the Alpha King, who sat at the head of the council table with an expression carved from stone. She fixed her gaze on the far wall and breathed slowly and thought about the younger wolves coughing in the lower village infirmary, about the empty grain stores, about the fires on the ridge. She thought about what it meant to love something larger than yourself. The elders began talking before Lord Valamont had even finished his wine. The politics were simple, they said. Unavoidable. The alliance required legitimacy through bloodline, and legitimacy required a Luna of standing. Lady Seraphine Valamont was accomplished, well-connected, the perfect political match. The pack's survival outweighed personal sentiment. Everyone at this table understood that. Everyone at this table also understood the unspoken half of the argument. Lyra was not noble. Her family name carried no titles, no lands, no alliances. Worse, her bloodline had been exiled from the high courts 2 generations ago. Under circumstances, the council records described only as a matter of deep dishonor, a phrase deliberately vague enough to mean anything and therefore impossible to defend against. No one had ever told her exactly what the scandal was. She had grown up understanding only that her family's name was a door that opened onto a room no one wanted to enter. The council voted on a Thursday morning. Lyra was not present for the vote. She didn't need to be. He came to her private chamber that evening, after the elders had retired and the corridors had gone quiet. He did not knock. He never had. He simply pushed the door open and stood in the frame with his jaw set and his golden eyes burning and said nothing for a long moment, the way he always did when he was deciding between the truth and something safer. He chose the truth, as he always did with her. "I won't do it." Lyra was standing at the window. She didn't turn. "You have to. Lyra, 200 soldiers." She finally faced him. 3 healers. Grain for 2 winters. The northern incursions stop because the Valamont name alone closes those borders. Her voice was steady. She had been rehearsing since Thursday. "Tell me which one of those things you're willing to sacrifice. Tell me which of the people dying in that infirmary you're willing to lose." His expression broke, just at the edges. "That's not a fair question." "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." She crossed the room and stopped in front of him, close enough that she could feel the familiar warmth radiating from his chest, close enough to remember every reason this was unbearable. "If the pack survives because I step away," she said, "then I will step away." He reached for her hand. She let him hold it. Just once, just for tonight. The bond between them didn't break that evening. It bent, stretched thin as wire, invisible to the world, but unbroken where it mattered. Neither of them spoke of that again. The world would never know the difference. There had been a time when they shared everything. A bedroom in their father's small stone cottage at the edge of the pack's lower district. A patched wool blanket on winter nights. A single candle they passed between them when one couldn't sleep, trading whispered stories in the dark, until the flame guttered and the cold pressed in, and they curled toward each other, the way young wolves do instinctively, without thinking, because warmth was warmth, and family was family, and the world outside hadn't yet taught them to be anything other than sisters. That was before the Alpha King, before the court, before Lyra's name began appearing in places Seraphine had always assumed were reserved for her. She had never said it plainly. Seraphine was far too careful for plain, but Lyra had grown up watching her sister's face, the way you learn to read weather. The particular stillness that settled over her features when the Alpha King crossed a room toward Lyra instead of her, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth when the senior warriors called Lyra by name with genuine respect, the way her eyes moved during council gatherings, cataloguing who listened when Lyra spoke and who merely waited for her to finish. Seraphine had their father's title. She had the correct bloodline, the correct education, the correct way of moving through a room. What she didn't have was the thing Lyra had never tried to earn, and somehow collected anyway, the instinctive trust of people who had seen her bleed for something and do it quietly, without asking for recognition. That was the wound Seraphine had never stopped pressing. The role reversal had taken less than a fortnight to become unbearable. Within 2 weeks of the council's decision, Seraphine had moved into the Luna's private sitting room, not the Luna's chambers. Not yet, but close enough to make the point. She began attending court functions on the Alpha King's left side. She consulted with the household staff about ceremony preparations, about floral arrangements and table settings, and the proper protocol for receiving visiting noble houses, in a tone that suggested these were conversations she was already entitled to have. She was gracious about it. That was the most suffocating part. She was impeccably, publicly gracious, always with a soft word for Lyra in company, always with a gentle smile that the room could see and interpret as sisterly warmth. It was in private that the mask slipped. 3 days before the ceremony, Lyra had been crossing the upper corridor toward the records room when Seraphine fell into step beside her, uninvited, her silk skirts whispering against the stone floor. You've been avoiding the preparation gatherings, Seraphine observed pleasantly. I haven't been invited to the preparation gatherings, Lyra said. No. A small pause. I suppose that would be awkward. They walked in silence for a moment. Lyra kept her eyes forward. You should know, Seraphine continued, her voice dropping into something softer and more precise, that I hold no ill feeling toward you. This situation is simply what it is. Politics are rarely personal. Lyra said nothing. You were always capable, Seraphine added, with the particular generosity of someone offering a compliment they've carefully measured for maximum condescension. In your own way, but capability isn't the same as suitability. You understand that? Lyra stopped walking. She turned and looked at her sister, really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to anymore, and saw exactly what had always been there beneath the composure. Not cruelty, precisely. Something colder than cruelty. Certainty. You were always meant to step aside for someone better, Seraphine said quietly. I think, somewhere, you've always known that. She smiled once small, composed, final, and continued down the corridor alone. Lyra stood in the empty hallway for a long moment. Then she went to pack. She had very little, in the end. The battered leather trunk from her father's cottage. 2 changes of practical clothing. Her training leathers, worn soft at the knees and elbows. A small book of northern pack maps she had annotated herself over 3 years of border patrol. The single personal item she allowed, a river-smoothed grey stone she had carried since childhood. Unremarkable and therefore hers in a way nothing else in Moonspire had ever quite been. Her plan was simple because simple plans were harder to talk yourself out of. Leave before dawn. Before the pack stirred. Before the ceremony aftermath rippled through the corridors. Before anyone thought to look for her, or worse, before anyone confirmed they hadn't thought to look at all. Slip through the eastern gate. Take the forest road north. And become, as cleanly and completely as possible, someone the Silver Moon Pack used to know. She had almost convinced herself she was ready. And then she noticed. It was a small thing at first. A detail that didn't fit. The Alpha King had been calm. Not the visible composure he performed for the court, she knew that version intimately. Had studied its architecture for years. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the precise moment to act on it. She had seen that expression once before. The night before he ended a siege negotiation by arresting the opposing lord mid-sentence, having spent 3 days appearing to consider terms he had never intended to accept. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed beside her packed trunk. What are you waiting for? She didn't sleep. The Alpha King had not slept properly in 6 weeks. Not since the night Lord Aldrich Valamont had sat across the council table with that carefully rehearsed smile and laid out his terms with the unhurried patience of a man who already knew the answer. Something had snagged in the Alpha King's mind like cloth catching on a splinter, small, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore once felt. The offer was too complete. That was it. That was the thing that wouldn't let him rest. Every crisis the pack faced had been anticipated, every weakness addressed. The grain shortage, the border incursions, the closed trade routes, the specific healers needed for the specific illness spreading through the lower valley house. Valamont had arrived with solutions tailored so precisely to Moonspire's vulnerabilities that the only explanation was either extraordinary intelligence or extraordinary preparation. Neither possibility was comforting. He began quietly. A private letter to an old contact in the Eastern Court archives, requesting historical records on the Valamont bloodline. A second letter to a wolf historian he had studied under as a young man, asking about noble house alliances over the past century. He told no one. He signed nothing with his title. He wrote in the cipher he and Lyra had developed together during the border campaign 3 years ago, the one no one else in Moonspire knew existed. He waited. The replies came back within a fortnight, wrapped in unmarked courier leather. He read them alone, by a single candle, in the small antechamber of his private study that the household staff had been instructed never to enter without explicit invitation. The first letter told him that House Valamont had financially engineered the collapse of 2 other packs in the previous decade. Both collapses had followed the same pattern, a slow accumulation of pressure, economic and military, followed by a timely offer of salvation. Both pacts had accepted, neither retained meaningful autonomy within 5 years. The second letter was older, more fragile, the handwriting cramped and careful. His historian contact had apparently spent 3 nights in a restricted archive to find it. He had sent it without commentary, which told the Alpha King everything about how alarmed the man was. It was a transcription of a text called The Rites of Binding, a ceremonial document predating the current Pact Council by 4 centuries. The Alpha King read it twice before he understood what he was looking at. The blood oath of dominion was not a myth. He had heard the phrase once, years ago. In the context of dismissed superstition, old pack stories used to frighten young wolves away from political marriages with houses of questionable character. He had filed it alongside other ceremonial folklore and never revisited it. He revisited it now. The ritual was elegant in the way that truly dangerous things often are. Simple in its requirements, devastating in its consequences. During a lunar crowning ceremony, if the ceremonial crown had been prepared with the correct runes small enough to be invisible to the untrained eye, activated by the blood contact of the crowning ritual itself, the oath would bind the sitting Alpha's power to the Luna's bloodline in perpetuity, not to the Luna herself, to her bloodline. Every Alpha King who followed would owe his authority, his legitimacy, his very right to rule, to House Valamont. The throne would remain standing. The Alpha would retain his title, but the power behind it would belong to someone else, invisibly, irrevocably, for as many generations as the bloodline survived. The ritual required one specific condition. The Luna candidate had to carry Valamont blood. Seraphine did. He set the document down and stared at the candle flame for a long time. Then he pulled out the third letter, the one he had sent to his most trusted man in the castle's own records vault, asking for a full accounting of which elders had communicated with House Valamont in the 18 months preceding the alliance offer. 4 names. He recognized all of them. 3 sat on the inner council. 1 was the elder priest who would perform the ceremony. The crown was already in the castle. It had been delivered as a gift from House Valamont, a gesture of goodwill, the elders had said, a ceremonial treasure appropriate to the occasion. He had allowed it without question. He retrieved it that night from the ceremonial vault. He examined it for 2 hours under magnification. The runes were there, etched into the inner band where the metal met the scalp, barely visible even under direct candlelight, arranged in a pattern that would activate the moment blood contact completed the crowning rite. He set it down carefully and breathed. Then he went back to the archive letters. Because there was one more thing, the historian had included a footnote, almost apologetic in its brevity, as though the old man wasn't certain it was relevant, a reference to a second bloodline mentioned in the same ancient texts, a lineage connected to the Silver Moon throne, not through politics or alliance, but through original founding, the bloodline from which the Pact's ruling line had supposedly descended before the great restructuring 4 centuries ago, a bloodline that had been deliberately erased from official records. The historian had included one identifying detail. Descendants carried a mark, faint, silver, appearing on the inner wrist. The Alpha King sat very still. Then he thought of Lyra standing in the winter courtyard 3 years ago, her sleeve pushed back as she examined a sparring injury and the small, pale mark he had noticed and never thought to question. He closed the letters. He had everything he needed. Now he simply had to wait for the ceremony. He found the archive on a Wednesday, 3 levels beneath the castle's main vault, behind a wall that the architectural plans listed as solid foundation stone, was a door. It was not hidden dramatically, no false panel, no elaborate mechanism. Just a door that had been built into the stone and then plastered over so many centuries ago that the plaster had hardened to near indistinguishable consistency with the surrounding wall. He found it only because he had spent 4 nights with a candle pressed close to the lower vault's eastern wall, looking for exactly the kind of careful, deliberate erasure that the historian's footnote had implied. The plaster came away in sheets. The door behind it was iron, old enough that the hinges had fused slightly with rust, requiring force enough to make his shoulders ache before it gave. Beyond it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness that smelled of cold stone and something older parchment, dust, the particular dry stillness of air that hasn't moved in generations. He brought the candle down. The archive was a single room, no larger than a modest bedchamber. Its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelving that bowed slightly under the weight of what it carried. Hundreds of documents, scrolls, bound folios, loose parchment, stacked in careful order, that had survived undisturbed long enough to become its own kind of fragile architecture. He did not touch anything carelessly. He worked methodically, the way Lyra had once taught him to approach a tracking problem. Start with what you can establish, move outward from certainty, and don't allow urgency to make you sloppy. He spent the first hour simply cataloguing, reading titles and dates by candlelight without removing anything from its place. The documents were old, older than the current council structure, older than the moonspire keep itself in its present form. Some predated the written histories he had studied as a young alpha by more than a century. He found what he was looking for in the third hour, a folio bound in leather that had darkened almost to black with age, sealed with wax that had long since crumbled. Inside, in handwriting so precise it suggested someone who understood they were recording something that must survive, was a full account of the Silver Moon Pack's founding lineage. He read it without moving. The original ruling bloodline of the Silver Moon Pack was not the line currently recognized by the Council. It had never been. 4 centuries ago, the pack had been ruled by a family whose name appeared throughout the folio, with a quiet, consistent reverence, a bloodline that had held the Alpha throne not through conquest or political alliance, but through something the document described simply as the Old Bond, a connection to the pack's founding magic so fundamental that the land itself had recognized their authority. They had been, by every account in the archive, exceptional rulers, which was precisely why they had been destroyed so carefully. The coup was not recorded in any official history the Alpha King had ever studied. It had been thorough enough to ensure that. What he read now was the version that someone had hidden rather than burned, preserved by a loyal archivist who had apparently understood that truth, even buried truth, was worth the risk of keeping. A rival faction within the pack's own elder council had orchestrated it, not through open challenge that would have failed, through patience, through the slow, deliberate corruption of record-keeping, through political marriages that shifted power incrementally over 2 generations until the moment came to simply declare the old bloodline illegitimate, cite a manufactured scandal as justification, and exile what remained of the family before any organized resistance could form. Their name was struck from every official document, their descendants scattered, stripped of title and land, forbidden from the high courts under pain of exile enforced not through law but through the kind of quiet, persistent social pressure that requires no written policy because everyone understands the consequence of defiance. The folio's final pages contained a single document that had been folded separately from the rest, as though its author had considered destroying it and decided against it at the last moment. A prophecy, brief, precise, written in the old ceremonial dialect that the Alpha King had studied enough to read slowly but accurately. The throne taken by politics shall not hold. The true line does not end with exile. The rightful Luna carries the mark of the founding bond silver on the wrist, given not by ceremony but by blood. When the mark is recognized before the court, the old magic wakes. What was stolen cannot be permanently kept. He read it 3 times. Then he sat back on his heels in the candlelit silence of the hidden room and thought about a winter courtyard 3 years ago. Lyra, her sleeve pushed back, frowning at a sparring cut on her forearm. The mark he had noticed small, pale, silvery white against her inner wrist, and assumed was an old scar without thinking further about it. Not a scar, a birthmark. The silver mark. He understood, with a certainty that settled into him like cold water, exactly what Lyra was. He also understood, with equal clarity, what would happen if the council discovered it before he could act. 4 elder names on that letter, an elder priest already complicit. People who had arranged one exile to protect a stolen throne would not hesitate to arrange another. Or worse, he could not warn her. Any private conversation now would be watched, reported, used. He needed witnesses. He needed the entire court present, every noble house, every eye in the realm focused on Moonspire's grand hall. At the precise moment he revealed what was hidden in her blood. He needed the ceremony. He closed the folio carefully and climbed back up to the light. The grand hall had never felt smaller. Lyra stood in her place to the Alpha King's right and watched the elder priest lift the ceremonial crown from its velvet cushion with both hands, the way one carries something sacred. The chandeliers above threw fractured light across the gold and pearl, scattering brilliance across the marble floor and the faces of 1,000 watching wolves. And for one suspended moment, the scene was exactly what it was meant to be. Beautiful, solemn, historic, the kind of moment that gets recorded in official annals. The kind that gets remembered. Seraphine stepped forward to receive it. She moved with the particular grace of a woman who had rehearsed this exact sequence of steps enough times that it had become muscle memory. Chin lifted, shoulders back, the slight incline of the head that suggested humility without actually conceding any. The white silk of her gown caught the light as she moved. The pearl crown already in her hair gleamed. She looked, Lyra thought distantly, precisely like what the court wanted a Luna to look like. The elder priest began the words of the crowning rite. Ancient syllables, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, filled the hall in the measured cadence of ceremony. Lyra felt the sound more than heard it, a vibration in the stone beneath her feet, in the air against her skin. The pack's oldest magic stirred in the acoustics of the room the way it always did during ritual, half felt, half imagined, the collective breath of a lineage longer than any living memory. She fixed her gaze on the floor, breathed out slowly. Almost over. The priest's voice rose toward the crowning phrase, the final line before the crown descended, before the bond was sealed, before the world rearranged itself permanently into a shape Lyra would have to learn to live inside. By the ancient rites of the moon and the law of the silver pack. Stop! The word landed in the hall like a stone dropped from a great height. The priest's voice died. His hands froze, the crown suspended inches above Seraphine's bowed head, hovering in the sudden, absolute silence, with an almost absurd delicacy, as though the moment itself had forgotten how to continue. Every eye in the hall moved to the Alpha King. He stood exactly where he had stood throughout the ceremony, at the altar's center, dark-clad and still. But something had changed in his bearing, the careful, diplomatic composure he had maintained for 6 months, through council sessions and alliance negotiations, and the slow performance of a man accepting what politics demanded was gone. What remained was something the court had seen only rarely and always remembered afterward. The Alpha King, when he had decided. Seraphine lifted her head slowly. A single furrow appeared between her brows, the first crack in the composure. "My king," she said carefully, "the rite will not continue." He turned from her without ceremony, as though she had already ceased to be the relevant person in the room. His gaze moved to the 4 elder council members in the front row, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who wants the people he is looking at to understand that he has been looking at them for some time. The eldest shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat. "Your Majesty," the man began, "the rite must be completed before." The Alpha King reached inside his coat. The sound that moved through the hall was not quite a gasp. It was the collective intake of breath from 1,000 people, simultaneously losing certainty about what they were witnessing. The iron dagger caught the chandelier light as he drew it, its blade shimmering with the faint red pulse of the runes etched along its length, alive in a way that cold metal should not be alive, radiating the particular wrongness of ancient magic, activated by proximity to its target. The elder priest saw it first. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that the man beside him reached out instinctively to steady him. "That blade," the priest whispered. "You recognize it?" The Alpha King's voice was not a question. He held the dagger at eye level, angled so that the runes caught the light fully, so that every face in the front rows could see them burning. "Good. Then you can confirm for this court what it is." The priest's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I'll do it then." The Alpha King turned to face the hall. All of it, every tear, Every row, every watching face, from the front nobility to the standing wolves packed against the rear walls. His voice carried without effort, the trained projection of a ruler who had addressed armies in open fields. This is a blood oath dagger, a ritual instrument used to detect and activate forbidden binding magic. He paused. Magic that is currently present in this room. The hall erupted, not in the organized way of formal protest, in the immediate, instinctive chaos of a crowd that has just been told the ground beneath it is not solid. Voices colliding, questions thrown without direction, the rustle and press of bodies shifting as people turned to their neighbors, seeking confirmation that they had heard correctly. Seraphine's composure did not shatter. It hardened. "This is absurd." She stepped forward from the altar, her voice cutting through the noise with the sharp clarity of genuine outrage or a flawless performance of it. "My king, I don't know what you believe you've found, but to halt a sacred ceremony on the basis of the crown, Seraphine." She stopped. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ceremonial crown, still suspended in the elder priest's trembling hands, with the expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has now finished being patient. "Examine the inner band," he said to the priest quietly. "Tell me what you find." The priest looked as though he would rather do anything else on earth, but the hall was watching, and the Alpha King's eyes were on him, and there was nowhere to go. He turned the crown in his hands, brought it close to his face. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. When the priest looked up, whatever doubt had remained in the room about whether the Alpha King was telling the truth dissolved completely. The old man's expression was not the confusion of someone who had found nothing. It was the horror of someone who had found exactly what they prayed they wouldn't. "The runes," he said. The words came out barely above a whisper. They're inside the band, etched into the interior. We didn't examine." "No," the Alpha King agreed. "You didn't." He stepped down from the altar and crossed to the ceremonial table at the hall's center, where the dagger in his hand met the crown's surface in a single, deliberate contact. The reaction was immediate. The runes on the dagger blazed not faintly now, not pulsing, but fully alive, pouring red light across the altar in sharp geometric lines. The crown answered. The hidden runes inside the band ignited in sequence, spreading around the interior in a pattern that was suddenly, unmistakably, terrifyingly visible to everyone in the front half of the hall. Red light bled through the gold and pearl from the inside, turning the beautiful ceremonial object into something that looked like a wound. Seraphine stared at it. For the first time all evening, she said nothing. The Alpha King faced the court. "This ceremony," he said, "was never about strengthening this pack." His voice filled every corner of the hall. It was about stealing its throne. The chaos that followed was immediate and total. Elders shouting, nobles demanding explanation. 2 of the 4 compromised council members attempting simultaneously to speak over each other in a way that, to anyone watching carefully, confirmed their guilt more efficiently than any evidence could have. Seraphine recovered herself enough to begin denying, her voice rising above the noise with practiced authority, insisting on fabrication, on misinterpretation, on the Alpha King's state of mind. But the crown was still glowing. Red light pulsed steadily from the inner band, patient and indifferent to human protest, broadcasting its purpose to every eye in Moonspire's grand hall with the simple, inarguable clarity of ancient magic that has finally been asked to show itself. The conspiracy was real, and now 1,000 wolves had seen it with their own eyes. The hall had become something between a courtroom and a storm. Nobles pressed forward from the rear tiers, straining for a better view of the glowing crown still suspended in the elder priest's shaking hands. Lords conferred urgently with their neighbors. Ladies who had arrived expecting to witness a wedding were gripping each other's arms with the wide-eyed intensity of people who understood, instinctively, that they were watching something that would be retold for generations. The 4 compromised elders had abandoned any pretense of dignity. 2 were speaking over each other in increasingly desperate tones. A third had gone, the particular gray color of a man, calculating how quickly a conspiracy unravels once its physical evidence is glowing in public, and the fourth had gone entirely silent, which was somehow worse than all the noise. The elder council chair slammed his ceremonial staff against the marble floor 3 times the traditional call for order that the hall ignored completely. "This is a fabrication!" he had to shout to be heard. "The Alpha King has been manipulated into—" "By whom?" the Alpha King asked simply. The question cut through the noise with surgical precision. The elder faltered. "The evidence stands before you," the Alpha King continued, gesturing toward the crown without looking at it. "The runes are visible to every person in this hall. If you would like to argue that what you can see with your own eyes is a fabrication, I invite you to explain the mechanism." Silence fell in concentric rings outward from the altar. Into that silence, Seraphine stepped forward. She had recovered her composure mostly. The edges were showing, a brightness in her eyes that was not triumph now but something closer to desperation wearing the costume of anger. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular authority of a woman who has spent her entire life understanding that confidence, performed convincingly enough, can substitute for truth in a crowded room. "I know what this is," she announced. Her gaze moved deliberately, with purpose directly to Lyra. "This is the result of months of quiet manipulation by someone who could not accept that she was no longer relevant." The hall stirred. "My king." Seraphine's voice softened into something approaching sorrow, perfectly calibrated. "She has been working against this alliance from the beginning. Everything you believe you found those letters, the archive, this so-called evidence. Ask yourself who had reason to construct it. Ask yourself who had everything to gain." Several faces in the crowd turned toward Lyra. She stood exactly where she had stood throughout the ceremony. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She kept her expression still with the discipline of someone who has had long practice at being looked at without being seen. And she met the turning faces with the simple, quiet steadiness of a person who knows the truth and is waiting for the room to catch up to it. She did not look afraid. She looked tired. The Alpha King turned from Seraphine and walked down from the altar. Not quickly. Not with any visible urgency. He crossed the marble floor of the grand hall, the way he crossed every room, as though the space had been arranged around him rather than the other way around, and the crowd parted ahead of him without being asked, purely by instinct, the way wolves part for something they recognize as apex without needing to be told. He stopped in front of Lyra. She looked up at him. Something moved across his expression, brief, private, the compressed language of 2 people who have spent years learning to communicate in the margins. He reached out and took her left hand. She didn't resist. She wasn't sure she could have. He turned her wrist upward, gently, and pushed the sleeve of her gown back to expose the inner wrist. Then he lifted her arm, so that the chandelier light fell directly across the faint silver mark on her skin. Small, pale, shaped like nothing in particular, and therefore unmistakably itself, shimmering faintly in the light, with a quality that had nothing to do with the chandeliers above. The gasp moved through the hall in a wave, not the scattered murmurs of confusion from earlier, a single, unified sound from 1,000 people who had just seen something their instincts recognized before their minds caught up. "Her bloodline," the Alpha King said, into the silence that followed, "was never disgraced." His voice carried to every corner of the hall. "It was stolen from the throne." For a moment nothing moved. Then the crown moved. The elder priest made a strangled sound as the ceremonial crown shifted in his hands, not violently, but with the unmistakable purposefulness of something responding to a signal. The red light of the blood oath runes flickered, guttered, and died. In its place, a silver luminescence began to build from somewhere inside the gold itself, rising through the metalwork like light through water, soft and extraordinarily clear. The priest, with the expression of a man who has run out of options, turned instinctively towards Seraphine and held the crown toward her. It dimmed. The silver light pulled back, contracted, as though the crown had registered her proximity and made a decision about it. He turned toward Lyra. The crown blazed. Silver light poured from it in every direction, flooding the altar and the surrounding marble with cold, clean radiance. that bore no resemblance to the red pulse of the blood oath runes. This was something older, something that felt less like magic and more like recognition. Like a door that had been locked for 4 centuries clicking open because the right key had finally come within range. Seraphine made a sound that was not quite a word. The crowd did not need the Alpha King to explain what they were seeing. The pack's own ancient magic had spoken in a language every wolf in the hall understood beneath thought, beneath reason, in the oldest part of what they were. Lyra stood in the silver light with her wrist still raised in the Alpha King's hand, and felt something shift in her chest, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter and more foundational than either, recognition, like something that had always been true finally being said aloud. The silver light was still pouring from the crown when Seraphine laughed. It was not the sound Lyra expected. Not rage, not desperation, a short, precise laugh, stripped of performance, carrying none of the gracious composure that had defined every public moment of the past 6 months. What came out of her sister in that moment was something Lyra had never heard before, and the hearing of it was like watching a door swing open onto a room she hadn't known existed. This was who Seraphine actually was. "Do you know what's extraordinary?" Seraphine said. Her voice was calm, conversational almost. She addressed the hall as though she was still in control of it, as though the glowing crown in the elder priest's hands were a minor inconvenience rather than the collapse of everything she had constructed. All of this, every piece of it, and you still almost didn't stop it in time. She turned to the Alpha King. "I knew about the blood oath before my father made the offer." She said it simply, factually. The confession of a woman who has calculated that denial is no longer useful and has decided that honesty, deployed correctly, can still be a weapon. I have known about it since I was 16 years old. My father spent 11 years preparing this. The sickness in the valley, the closed trade routes, the border incursions. A ripple of horror moved through the crowd. "We're all arranged." She let the silence hold for exactly a moment. "We didn't arrive to save your pack. We arrived because we had spent a decade making certain you would need saving." The hall erupted. Whatever noise had preceded this moment had been confusion. What followed was something raw, the sound of 1,000 wolves understanding simultaneously that they had been hunted, that every loss of the past year had been engineered, that the sickness in the lower village infirmary had been a calculated move in someone else's political game. Seraphine did not wait for the noise to resolve. She raised her hand. The signal was small and deliberate, and Lyra recognized it for what it was a half-second before it landed, the kind of gesture that has been agreed upon in advance, rehearsed, assigned meaning in a room far from this one. The Valemont soldiers stationed at the hall's perimeter moved. There were more of them than Lyra had realized. They had been distributed through the ceremonial guard positions with the patience of people who had been planning for this contingency, not the primary plan, but the backup, the contingency for the moment everything went wrong. 40, perhaps 50 men, positioned at every exit, every approach to the altar, every staircase to the upper tiers. "Seize the altar," Seraphine said. "Hold the Alpha King." For one fractured second, the hall simply stared. Then the Alpha King's own guard moved, and the Grand Hall of Moonspire Keep became something it had not been in living memory. A battlefield. The collision was immediate, and total pack warriors launching from their positions with the trained efficiency of wolves who had been watching the Valemont soldiers shift and had been ready for exactly this since the moment the crown began to glow. Crystal shattered somewhere above as a chandelier swayed from the vibration of bodies against stone. Nobles scattered from the floor toward the upper tiers, clearing space with the instinctive self-preservation of people who understand the difference between a political confrontation and actual violence. Lyra moved. She wasn't conscious of deciding to. Her body simply understood before her mind caught up the same instinct that had carried her through 3 years of border patrol and 2 years of warrior training. The knowledge that in chaos, stillness is a choice you make deliberately or have made for you. She crossed the floor toward the altar. The crown was still in the elder priest's hands. The old man had pressed himself against the altar's edge with the expression of someone who has outlived their usefulness to every faction simultaneously and is hoping not to be noticed. When Lyra reached him, he looked at her with something that might have been relief. She took the crown from his hands. The moment her fingers closed around the metal, the silver light erupted. Not the gradual building luminescence of before, an immediate, total surge, as though the crown had been waiting with held breath for precisely this contact, and could now finally exhale. Silver radiance exploded outward from the altar in every direction simultaneously, flooding the hall from floor to ceiling in cold, extraordinary light that passed through the bodies of 1,000 wolves like a chord struck on an instrument built from the pack's own founding magic. The fighting stopped. Not gradually, not as combatants registered the light and made decisions. It stopped the way sound stops when something louder happens instantly, completely. Everybody in the hall arrested mid-motion by something that bypassed conscious choice and reached directly into the oldest layer of what every wolf in the room was. The silver moon magic had been asleep for 4 centuries. It was awake now. Lyra stood at the altar with the crown in her hands and felt it move through her like a current, not painful, not violent, but immense. The way standing in a river is immense. The pressure of something ancient and enormous that has been waiting longer than any living memory for something it recognizes. Here, it seemed to say. Finally. Here. The Valamont soldiers were the first to break. Not through defeat in combat, through something more fundamental. They were not silver moon wolves. The pack's founding magic was not their magic, held no claim on them, carried no authority in their blood. What they felt was not recognition, but its opposite, the deep, instinctive wrongness of standing in a place that has just made clear you do not belong here. They fell back toward the exits. 3 tried to hold their positions. The Alpha King's warriors closed around them with efficient, unhurried certainty, and that was the end of it. The 4 compromised elders were surrounded before any of them thought to run. The Alpha King crossed the floor to where they stood, 2 still attempting to protest. 1 silent, one who had the clarity to understand that the moment for strategy had passed, and spoke 2 words to the captain of his guard. Arrest them. Seraphine had not moved from her position at the center of the hall. She stood in the silver light with her white silk gown and her pearl crown, and her hands clasped before her, composed, still, the posture of someone who has not yet decided how this ends. When the Alpha King turned to her, she met his gaze with the last remnant of what had always made her formidable. She did not look away. He crossed to her slowly. When he stopped, he reached up and lifted the pearl crown from her hair with both hands, deliberate and without ceremony, the mirror image of the crowning that had never happened. "Seraphine Valamont," he said, loudly enough for every remaining ear in the hall. "You are stripped of all titles, honors, and claims associated with this pack. House Valamont's alliance is dissolved. Your father's people will be escorted to the border before dawn." He turned to the hall. "Let every house present bear witness." The silver light held. Seraphine stood in the middle of Moonspire's grand hall, in front of every noble family in the realm, stripped of everything she had spent 11 years arranging to take, and for the first and only time in Lyra's memory, her sister had nothing left to perform, just the truth of what she had always been, standing in the light, fully visible. The silver light did not fade. It settled the way light settles after sunrise, transitioning from event into simply the quality of the air, present and permanent, and no longer requiring anyone's astonishment. The grand hall of Moonspire Keep, which had been in turn ceremonial, chaotic, and briefly something approaching a battlefield, was now simply still. The wounded had been moved to the hall's edges. The Valamont soldiers had been escorted out. The compromised elders were gone, their ceremonial seats empty in the front row with the particular blankness of spaces from which something has been removed and not yet replaced. 1,000 wolves stood in the quiet and waited. Lyra stood at the altar with the crown still in her hands. She had not put it down. She had not put it on. She held it the way you hold something whose weight you are still calculating carefully, with both hands, aware of it in a way that went beyond the physical. The silver light moved through the metalwork in slow pulses, patient, unhurried, as though it had waited 4 centuries and had no objection to waiting another few minutes. She heard him cross the floor before she saw him. She would always hear him first. That had been true since the beginning, the specific quality of his footstep, the way the room's acoustics changed slightly when he moved through it, as though the space itself adjusted to accommodate him. She had stopped examining why she noticed that. Some things you simply accept about yourself. The Alpha King stopped in front of her. He was not performing anything now. The composure of the ruler, the calculated stillness of the man who had spent 6 months waiting for the right moment, all of it was gone, and what remained was simply him, looking at her the way he had always looked at her in private, in the moments between everything else, when the world wasn't requiring anything from either of them. Lyra. Just her name, nothing attached to it. She looked up at him. You could have told me. I couldn't risk. I know. She did know. That was the worst part, and also the most familiar part. The specific exhaustion of understanding exactly why the person you trust made the choice that hurt you. I know why you didn't. A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that people who have known each other long enough have learned to inhabit without filling. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. Not as Alpha King, not in front of the court. Just I need to ask you. She waited. Will you take it? His eyes moved briefly to the crown in her hands, then back to her face. Not because the magic says so, not because the bloodline says so, because you choose to. Lyra looked down at the crown. The silver light pulsed once, gently, against her palms. She thought about a stone cottage at the edge of the lower district, a patched wool blanket, a shared candle in the dark. She thought about 3 years of border patrol and 2 years of council chambers, and 1 council vote she had not been present for. She thought about a battered leather trunk packed beside a bed, and a plan to leave before dawn, and a single question she had sat awake all night asking herself. What are you waiting for? She hadn't known then that the answer was this. Yes, she said. He took the crown from her hands, with the same deliberateness he had brought to every action tonight. Careful, intentional, nothing wasted. He held it for a moment, and something in his expression shifted into a territory she had no name for. Something that was not quite solemnity, and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them. Then he raised it, and placed it on her head. The crown touched her hair. The silver light did not build gradually this time. It detonated a single, total burst of radiance that expanded from the altar outward in a perfect circle, flooding the grand hall from the marble floor to the vaulted ceiling, with light so clean and absolute that for one suspended moment there was nothing in the world but white and silver, and the ancient magic of the silver moon pack, exhaling 4 centuries of held breath in a single, complete release. Then it settled, and the court saw her, Lyra, in a simple grey gown, with no silk and no embroidery and no pearl crown to precede the moment, standing at the altar of Moonspire Keep, with the ceremonial crown blazing silver on her head, and the founding magic of the pack radiating from her like something that had always been true, and was only now being said aloud. The first person to bow was the elder priest. He moved before anyone else, folding forward with the instinct of a man who has spent his life in service to the pack's oldest traditions, and has just watched every one of them confirm something he will spend the rest of his life trying to deserve having. Witnessed, then the warriors, then the nobles, rippling outward from the front in a wave that moved through the hall the way the silver light had moved, not because anyone commanded it, not because protocol demanded it, but because 1,000 wolves were looking at their Luna, and their oldest instincts had simply arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. The sound that followed was not polite court applause. It was the sound a pack makes when something stolen has been returned full-throated, rough-edged, rising from the chest rather than the throat. The collective voice of every wolf in the room who had watched the past 6 months happen and had felt, without being able to name it, that something was wrong. They could name it now, and now it was right. Lyra stood in the noise and the light and felt it move through her, not the crown's magic this time, but something simpler and more devastating. The specific feeling of being seen, not as an obstacle, not as an inconvenience, not as the sister standing to the right, with her head bowed and her hands clasped. As herself, as what she had always been. She became aware, through the noise, that the Alpha King had moved. She looked down. He was kneeling, not the formal bow of ceremony, one knee on the marble, his head inclined, the gesture of a man making a personal acknowledgement rather than a political one. A recognition not of the crown, but of the bloodline behind it. Of 4 centuries of erasure being answered in a single evening. Of everything that had been taken from her family being named, formally and publicly, as taken. He held the position for 3 measured seconds. Then he rose and looked at her, and the noise of the hall fell away to the specific quiet of 2 people who have arrived, after a very long road, at the same place at the same time. He leaned close enough that only she could hear him beneath the sound of the crowd. "You were never meant to step aside," he said. "You were meant to rule beside me." Lyra looked out at the hall at the sea of bowed heads and raised voices, at the silver light still turning the marble floor into something that resembled the surface of a moonlit river, at the empty seats where the conspirators had sat and the full ones where her people stood. Her people. The thought arrived without fanfare. Simply, quietly, with the weight of something that has always been true finally finding its right name. She straightened her shoulders. The forgotten sister, the discarded mate, the girl who had packed a battered trunk and planned to leave before dawn and become, as cleanly as possible, someone the Silver Moon Pack used to know. She lifted her chin, and the true Luna of the Silver Moon Pack looked out at her court and did not look away. The end. If Lyra's story moved you, let me know in the comments. Every response you leave tells me what to write next. And subscribe. The next moonlit story is already waiting.